Welcome, listeners, to www.ironradio.org, the website and podcast for all things strength sports and sports nutrition. With your hosts, Lonnie Lowry.
Remember, Phil is like a gnarled old oak tree held together with scar tissue and bone spurs.
Rob Fortney.
And I'm telling you, the pain that I would suffer was beyond excruciating.
And Phil Stevens.
Do it, Rob. You'll kill all those nerves.
Thanks for listening.
Welcome, Iron Radio listeners. This is Lonnie Lowry. I am a sports nutrition and exercise physiology professor of about 15 years, and I'm a former competitive bodybuilder.
And this is Phil Stevens. I'm an international traveler and a powerlifter, strength coach. I run Strength Guild, chase a bunch of other stuff. So,
hey, this is Dr. Mike T. Nelson. I'm a faculty member at the Kerrig Institute, owner of Extreme Human Performance, and I'm actually at home this weekend.
Actually.
I am, actually.
And we have Dr. Steve Hertzler with us. Dr. Hertzler, maybe just a sentence about yourself?
Yeah, my name is Steve Hertzler. I am a PhD in human nutrition, a registered dietitian. Spent about 10 years in academia doing teaching and research at several different universities, and now I'm the Chief Science Officer for EAS Sports Nutrition.
Awesome.
And I also have a history with bodybuilding as well. I've loved it for many, many years.
Sweet. See, that makes you the best fit for a guest. Yep, absolutely. All right, folks, we are going to look at a little bit of news, listener mail, the usual bit. Not too much because we want to get to Dr. Hertzler's origin story. Let's see. From the mail and news department here.
Strength and muscle sport news.
The first bit of news I found out through Phil. I didn't see that, Phil, on Facebook. The top 10 best strength training fitness podcasts. And we're listed at number 2. Woohoo!
Oh, yep. Nice.
So, it was from the Massonomics guys. They seemed stunned that we have over 400 episodes. Yeah, pod fade is not what we do. So we are here for the long haul. So, yeah. So, neat stuff. I won't go on about it too much. It just basically talks about our sort of mix of egghead and meathead and that sort of thing and how it differs from other podcasts. And so, yeah, the Massonomics guys. There's other guys on this list, of course, a lot of the top ones that you might recognize. Barbell Shrugged and Mark Bell's Powercast. There's just a whole bunch on this list. So it's neat that they actually did this, right? Because I have yet to see, and I think they as well, have yet to have found any kind of top 10 list. Like, what are actually good strength fitness podcasts, Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, cool stuff. That
Very
was
cool.
Yeah, just literally like a week ago they came out with that. So thanks, guys, for that. That's cool. Next up, this is related. This is from Matt on Facebook. And a lot of listeners know I don't spend much time on the Book of Faces. But Matt says, good morning. On your recent episode, you talked about checking out the Mind Pump podcast. Your show and their show happen to be my two favorite fitness podcasts. I'd like to suggest that you listen to episode 509 because in the beginning they have a candid discussion about their bro talk and how it costs them listeners and some solutions that they have for that. You'll find that there are some things that you guys will agree with and others you won't. For example, they're pretty anti-supplementation, even with protein powders, except in a pinch. And they do push 2 products, and I'm not going to do that in this recording here, but they have 2 products that they push. Now, we are listener supported, of course, so we don't advertise products like that. But he says, now they are irreverent a lot of times. I can see you maybe not liking that, but they are a good show. Anyway, have a great day. So thanks, Matt, for that. I have yet to get around to that. It's just summer online teaching and 100 different things. I'm still trying to extract myself from the university for summer, and whatnot. So
yeah, I'll pass on their info. I hung out with them actually in Austin when they were there this past weekend a little bit. And when we got there, they were still recording a different podcast, and they didn't finish recording until almost like 12:45 in the morning. So I didn't get too much of a chance to talk to them. So
okay.
They may not be so eager to get up at 6 in the morning, but maybe they are. We'll find out.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I want to give a shout out. We were just talking about being listener supported. Of course, not everyone can step up, be a supporting member, or continue to do so. I do see the people who come through. So this is rather random, but thank you to the following people: Brian, Honey Fund was one of the one, Vicky and Alan. You guys are appreciated. You help keep the lights on, right? We're listener supported. It's sort of a public radio format. We appreciate that, so we don't run ads and that sort of thing. I have one bit of news. This is a listener mail from Karen. Sends good stuff all the time. This is not going to be something. If you're a vegan listener, I bet we don't have many. with Phil kind of promulgating the meat cleanse, I don't think we're going to have any. This is a abstract that she sent by Mirshahi and colleagues, Preventive Medicine 2017, Vegetarian Diet and All-Cause Mortality, Evidence from a Large Population-Based Australian Cohort, the 45 and Up study. So it starts, I won't read the whole abstract, of course, but it says the vegetarian diet is thought to have health benefits, including reductions in type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, obesity, compared to non-vegetarians. So what they did was they looked at a couple of different types. This is an association type study, right? It's not causal. It's not cause and effect, but they looked at vegans, pesco-vegetarians, semi-vegetarians. They looked at a couple of different groups. The semi-vegetarians are the ones eating meat less than once per week. Anyway, they analyzed these data, 250,000 participants roughly. So this is a large number of subjects, lots of statistical power. Again, it's just relationships, though. It's not causal. But the interesting thing, I'll kind of jump to the end out of respect for the guest here, but we found no evidence that following a vegetarian diet, a semi-vegetarian diet, or a pesco-vegetarian diet has an independent protective effect on all-cause mortality. In other words, often, of course, you hear that people that are vegans or some form of vegetarian, lacto-ovo, what have you, they say that, that increases longevity, reduces disease. They're not seeing it. Interesting. It says, following extensive adjustments for different confounding factors. So it's not like they're just clueless here. They tried to correct for several things and narrow it down to diet, but no significant differences in all-cause mortality for vegetarians versus non-vegetarians. Wow. Yeah. So I guess, there's at least one feather in the cap of the carnivores out there, right? So, again, the name is hard for me to pronounce. Mirshahi, Mihshahi and colleagues. So brand new stuff, spanking new from Karen. Thank you, Karen. I'm always interested in that, right? I try not to. I remember there's an old Sagan quote. He says we tend not to be especially critical when provided evidence that confirms our prejudices, right? And that does kind of confirm my prejudices. I think our digestive tract is created to digest meat in some ways, and I always point to the Mike Nelson story about being at the Smithsonian. And I took those pictures of you squatting down with the statues, those bronzes of cavemen butchering and eating meat, and stuff like that. But anyway, interesting stuff from the literature. Any other news, guys, from the lifting or nutrition world? Anything?
Yeah, World's Strongest Man is going on right now, but it's kind of hard to figure out who's on top of what and where. So
okay.
Because you're not really supposed to know until it airs, but there's people.
Yeah, I was gonna say they're not really airing it, right?
No, it's just going there. Like they're filming right now. I keep seeing stuff pop up. So there's been a lot of injuries and stuff like that. I know, but I can't tell you right now who's in first.
All right.
Definitively, I don't want to come out there and say something that's not right. So
okay. Well, maybe next week then, or
yeah, potentially, yeah.
Okay. All right, good stuff. Let's get to Steve. So, Dr. Hertzler, you're that rare combination, right? Bodybuilder, scientist, nutritionist, sort of all of the above. Makes you sort of the quintessential guest, I think, for us. How did this come to be? I mean, go back as far as you want in your history, but what brought you to, what you do today?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I must say I'm quite disappointed that I didn't get an invitation to the World's Strongest Man competition, but I watched those guys at the Arnold, and it's just phenomenal. I remember shaking hands with Brian Shaw one time, and my hand disappeared. Just humongous, amazing.
You know, Steve, and listeners should know, Steve is not a small dude, so this is that's significant, right? Those guys are giants. So
yeah, they're just massive. Yeah. So I mean, my story starts out in eastern Iowa. I grew up near Cedar Rapids. For any of you who've ever been there, you know that is the heart of wrestling country. And so I grew up idolizing a lot of the wrestlers down at the University of Iowa, went to a lot of home meets. Guy from my high school went to the University of Iowa, wrestled, won a couple national championships, and even made it to the Olympic trials. So, and our high school had won multiple state championships over the course of 10 or 15 years. So that was kind of sort of my introduction into sports and nutrition. Our coach did have a little nutrition module that he gave to all the wrestlers. I wrestled in junior high, wrestled in high school. I was actually a 98-pound wrestler my freshman year of high school. So I grew up being the smallest kids in my class, and I think, as is true with a lot of people in the bodybuilding world, I grew up having small man complex. I didn't like being the smallest guy in my class. I got beat by a girl in arm wrestling when I was in 7th grade.
Hey, just if I can interject, Phil's got some ladies at his gym. They'd beat most men in arm wrestling. Just saying.
They'd probably take me now. So I started learning about nutrition in high school. I wrestled for 2 years, and I did some weightlifting as part of the training for wrestling. And during my sophomore year of high school, I started lifting more and more, and I started enjoying the lifting more than I did the wrestling. You know, I didn't see a whole lot of future for myself in wrestling, and quite frankly, I started to enjoy the weightlifting a lot. I saw my first copy of Muscle and Fitness back around 1981. I think it had Steve Davis on the cover.
Oh, wow.
I don't know if any of you remember Steve Davis. He was a Mr. World.
Yes.
You know, former fat guy who, you know, just became I would say he had more of kind of like a Frank Zane type of physique. Beautiful lines. And so I just, I started doing bodybuilding, really following those routines. I was big into all the guys that were popular during the 80s. Tom Platz, Roy Callender, Casey Viator. I used to read the old Muscle Mag Internationals too. I had a whole collection of those. And I still love to read articles about the old school bodybuilders that were popular in my high school years. Went to some competitions where Roy Callender guest posed and Lou Ferrigno guest posed and stuff like that.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a great time, and fortunately my parents were really supportive of that. I spent some money on a gym membership, and gosh, the summer between my sophomore and junior year, I put on like 40 pounds.
Oh, wow.
It was kind of the combination of the lifting that I was doing and my growth spurt hitting at about the same time. Yep. And just people didn't recognize me. And when I came back to school in the fall, and, I started getting comments and stuff, and, that made you feel pretty good. I liked that.
Sure, yeah.
So it was a lot of positive affirmations there. And so I just, I basically kept going, and my dad said, well, if you're gonna knock off wrestling and really do this bodybuilding thing, then you need to go tell the coach you're not going out for wrestling anymore. And so I did. I had a face-to-face with him and said I found something I like better. which was a kind of hard meeting to have because the coach for my wrestling team was a former national champ at the University of Iowa, is now a Hall of Fame wrestling coach. So, but he was really skeptical of me at first, but I kept training, and through high school, I finally, when I got to be my senior year, I decided to do my first competition. I did the AAU Teenage Mr. Midwest, and it was in Rockford, Illinois. And it's kind of a story I always like to share with my students. I did this contest. I remember getting to the contest and looking around and thinking, oh my God, what have I done? Mm-hmm. Because, I trained in a college weight room, and there weren't really many other people to compare myself to. Mm-hmm. So when I looked in the mirror, I thought, wow, I look big, ha ha ha. And then I started to see who I was competing against, and I'm thinking, oh my word, what have I done? and I finally just made the decision. It's like, well, we drove, 4.5 hours to get here, so I guess I'll go up on stage and do what I came to do, and see what happens. And I was fortunate. I got 4th place in my class, and it was a good time. And the story I like to always tell my nutrition students is that, right after that show, I started eating, and I think I ate for about 2 days continuously. I had dieted quite a bit. I was probably down around 157 or 160, somewhere thereabouts. Mm-hmm. After I had cut all this weight, I gained 13 pounds overnight.
Wow. Yeah.
Just putting fluid back in and everything. So it was really it was a very formative experience. I just fell in love with the sport from then on. And in my senior year or two, I started to try to make some life decisions about where I was going from an education perspective. And so I was kind of vacillating between being a chiropractor and being a dietitian. And I actually had a scholarship lined up to do a pre-chiropractic type of path. Had shadowed a chiropractor and gotten a bunch of books on anatomy and stuff like that and everything. Had a dream one night that I was actually a chiropractor and had a patient come into my office who was morbidly obese and wanted to be adjusted. And I remember struggling over this patient in my dream and couldn't get the patient adjusted. And I woke up and I said, I am not going to be a chiropractor.
Oh, you still remember that, huh? You still remember the dream? Yep. Wow.
It was very vivid. And so that sort of shifted my focus to dietetics. And so I decided to do a bachelor's in community medical dietetics at a little school in La Crosse, Wisconsin called Viterbo College. They were a neat little school because they had a coordinated program in dietetics, which was nice because normally to do your registered dietitian status, you either have to do sort of a 4-year degree and do an internship afterwards somewhere else, or do a coordinated program in which your internship is actually incorporated into the last couple of years of your academic coursework. Mm-hmm. And so the program I had at Viterbo was a coordinated program, so I was able to do my internship during the last 2 years of my coursework, and then I was eligible to sit for the RD exam right away after I graduated. As I look back on it now, it's one of the, if your goal is to become an RD, that was really a good path for me to go. I know a lot of people do it sort of a more convoluted way. I was the only guy in a class of 8 students.
Oh, I hear that, man. I was the only guy in any dietetics class I ever took,
Yep. Which, by the way, I'm just going to say, to a lot of guys out there who think they might want to pursue dietetics, think about it. This is a profession that is 97% female.
Yep.
and a lot of the dietitians take very good care of their bodies. So that's all I'm going to say about that. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, Steve, were you during all the nutrition training and everything? In my experience, it was always that the bodybuilders were sort of the it's sort of the thorn in the instructor's side a little bit. Like, oh, this guy's coming out of left field. He's not the traditional, like you said, you're like in a 2 or 3% minority being a guy. On top of that, you're kind of a meathead. You're not fitting the usual mold. Are you still training through this period, or is the lifting on back burner for a while?
I was doing my best to train during that time, but the college that I went to had zero for a weight room, and so I had to try. If I was going to train somewhere, I had to get a membership at a fitness place, and quite frankly, I didn't have very much money, so I kind of had some off and on gym memberships. If my grandma gave me some money or something, I would, join up for a few months and train. And I never really totally lost touch with it, but it was hard to keep up with it during that time.
Mm-hmm. So then, did you hit the workforce? Did you go to grad school? I mean, because you went all the way through school, buddy. So.
Yeah, I did hit the workforce. What was kind of interesting is, during my time in medical dietetics, I did take a sports nutrition class, and one of my early influences, I think, in sports nutrition was Ellen Coleman, and she was just a really interesting person to me because she had dual master's degrees in exercise phys and public health, and she was an RD, and I was just really impressed with that. And I knew at some point I wanted to go to graduate school, kind of follow in that path, but I knew I wasn't really ready to go to graduate school right out of the gate after I graduated, so I got a job, and that was what basically happened to me. I got a job with Marriott, worked as a clinical dietitian at a hospital in Kalamazoo, Michigan, Borges Medical Center. Ultimately met my wife-to-be there, which was kind of neat. And, I spent a lot of time working on the cardiac nutrition floor and neurosurgery intensive care unit, things like that. Did some outpatient nutrition counseling, which was really challenging because you just never knew who you were going to get faced with in a particular day. You might have 4 patients lined up. One could be gestational diabetes. I even had one with a glycogen storage disorder.
Wow, interesting.
Yeah,
rare.
And then I got a call from another male dietitian who'd actually met my father, and so he calls me up and he says, one day, and he says, I'm thinking about doing a clinical job. Do you think it's a good idea? And I said, yeah, go for it. So the guy goes out to Great Falls, Montana, and gets a job in a hospital out there. A few months later, he calls me up and said, we need another dietitian. You're interested in moving to Great Falls, Montana?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm young. I'm like, there's mountains there. I'll go. And I was there for another about a year and a half. Again, doing a lot of inpatient work in cardiac nutrition, but I also taught nutrition in the Life Steps weight management program. Had a patient with eating disorders and stuff like that just taught me an incredible amount. I always tell students that I learned more from one patient than I did in a couple years of graduate school. It was about at that time that I put in about almost 3 years of clinical experience, and I said to myself, gosh, I don't know if I'm going to do clinical the rest of my life. One of the things that was always driving me is wanting to know what the science was behind all these recommendations that I was giving patients.
Right, yeah.
If I was telling people, why saturated fats increase their blood cholesterol, I wanted to know why. Yep. Why do saturated fats increase blood cholesterol? What's the mechanism here? And I just got more and more unsatisfied with just being a counselor without really understanding that what at the time was the scientific basis for what I was saying. I had some interesting expectations going into graduate school. I kind of thought that I could sort of pick my own major, and so I really wanted to study the effects of caffeine on sports performance. That was my big goal.
Cool.
And And the person who contacted me from University of Minnesota was a professor there named Dr. Dennis Saviano, and he said, well, I have money to study lactose intolerance. And I said, I guess I could get interested in lactose intolerance if somebody's going to give me an assistantship. Sure, I'll give that a try.
You know, Steve, I always wondered about that with you because I use you as an example when I talk to students sometimes about, like, some of that research, some of that data collection is not very glamorous, right? What you had to do, I think. And yet someone has to be able to come up with these recommendations. Like, you know, if a patient has lactose intolerance, limit it to sort of maybe half a dozen grams or so of lactose and no more. Otherwise, you know, gas production is increased or what have you, right? So, I mean, I won't go into gory details, but I still remember you telling stories about that, like how you actually, I don't want to say become a flatulence researcher, but,
yeah,
you know, that's like what leads to that path. But now I see that money kind of drew you in that direction, right? Because you had some support there.
Yep. You know, full disclosure, the support for that came from the National Dairy Council. They were very, very interested in this question at the time and trying to help people figure out the problem of lactose intolerance. And yeah, after I published my first study, I actually, and it was a study basically showing that I had done some work looking at adaptation of the bacteria in the colon to lactose feeding over time. And basically what we showed is that if you did the exact opposite of what most people do and actually start feeding people lactose who are lactose intolerant, the bacteria in the large intestine change dramatically, and their metabolic pathways change, and they can start to ferment lactose without producing as much gas and as much of a symptom response and those kinds of things. And it was kind of interesting because not long after we published that study, we got a hate mail letter from a nutritional anthropologist in Colorado who was very upset with us. He was Native American, and he was concerned that we were trying to push dairy products on people who, because they were lactose intolerant, he felt that, you know, they were kind of born to be lactose intolerant, and we shouldn't be pushing dairy products on people like that. And, you know, our contention always was, you know, we're not trying to necessarily push dairy products on people, but if you do want to eat them, we'd like to help you be able to eat them in a way that you can tolerate them and everything. It was, I kept the hate mail. I used to show it to the students all the time to illustrate sort of the dramatic response that sometimes nutrition research and controversy that it can generate in the public.
You know, Steve, if you look back, we talk almost monthly on the podcast about the gut microbiome now, and it gets so much attention, you know, the bacteria in the large intestine. And so you were looking at that literally decades before it really got trendy.
Yeah, it was fascinating. And, you know, we didn't have anywhere near the tools then that they have now. You know, one of the things that I used to have to do is collect fecal samples from lactose intolerant subjects. Mm-hmm. And we would take them to the laboratory, and we would put them in a blender, mm-hmm. and then, you know, we did different experiments on those fecal samples. We measured the activity of the enzyme that digests lactose that's found in the bacteria in the fecal sample. We measured bacterial counts. I used a device called a glove box, which was literally this enormous plexiglass bubble with openings that I could stick my hands into, where I could anaerobically grow bacteria. And so, you know, I did that kind of work. We were doing work in our laboratory with different yogurts and things like that, looking at the efficacy of different types of yogurt. We were interested in all these lactate type of preparations. And I remember one of the most vivid things I did is I started working with a gastroenterologist at the VA Medical Center in Minneapolis, in which we actually devised a pair of Mylar shorts or pantaloons made out of the same material they make Mylar balloons out of. And they actually put these shorts on me and duct tape me around the thighs and around the waist.
Oh, my Lord.
Hooked me up to a vacuum pump, pumped all the shorts, closed the valve in the shorts, and then fed me pinto beans and let me be on my merry
Wow.
let my bacteria be on their merry way.
Right. Like, like how do you, hearing your story, it makes sense. But right, like when you just hear this story, like the end game of this story, you're thinking, what? Like, how do you set out to become, a professional in something, and then suddenly you're strapped into Mylar shorts and they're sampling your farts, But biology is messy, right? I mean, it's like with the fecal stuff. Yeah, literally.
Well, I mean, the gastroenterologist was, his modus operandi here was that he used to get these people who would come into his office all the time, and they wanted to know why they had so much gas. And, people literally would send him samples of their own gas in jars in the mail and said, analyze this and tell me what's wrong with me. And, he would do a lot of the analysis because, if you analyze that gas, if it's largely nitrogen, then you know that the person's pretty much swallowing air. And so you deal with things like loose-fitting dentures and not drinking through a straw and avoiding carbonated beverages and those types of things. Mm-hmm. If the composition of the gas is more hydrogen, carbon dioxide, and methane, fermentation gases, then you got a completely separate issue. So there was a method to doing this. It wasn't just doing stuff for the sake of being gross. And playing around with weird stuff. There was an actual purpose to a lot of this.
Yeah, sure. I mean, a doctor will do blood samples to look at your lipid profile. Sampling bodily fluids and gases. That's how you do that stuff. Yep.
Yeah.
Well, let me fast forward then, because I know you competed in bodybuilding very recently. Before we go to break and we talk about some of your thoughts on junk science and whatnot, you've got all this clinical experience, right? You're learning in the trenches, both in the gym and in clinical settings and that kind of stuff. But it's pretty ballsy, frankly, to compete in your 40s. Why'd you do that?
Yeah, I competed once in college in 1987. That was the last time that I had competed. And and quite frankly, when I started working in academia, especially during the time when I was at Ohio State, I let myself get out of shape quite a bit. It was kind of the pressure of being on an academic tenure track position in a Carnegie One type of institution, and I just really, got immersed in the academic stuff, and I really. One day I woke up and I said, oh my gosh, I have a gut. Wow. I've never had a gut before in my life. Mm-hmm. And, that condition kind of continued for a while. And about 4 years ago or so, my brother, who had suffered mightily from anxiety disorder and depression, took his own life. And it kind of woke me up. And I said to myself, gosh, I gotta take better care of myself and better control of my own health and fitness. I'm the guy who's supposed to know what to do all the time. And so I made the decision. I said, I'm going to go ahead and try to do this again at the master's level. So I picked out a small competition here in the Columbus area. It was a steroid tested competition, basically a polygraph test. Mm-hmm. And did a competition. There weren't very many people who showed up, especially in the master's class, and I happened to win, but I didn't have a lot of competition either, so I don't know how much I can brag on myself about that. But
still, that's positive.
It was still a lot of fun.
Cool. No, that's cool stuff. All right, I'll tell you what. Out of the interest of time, we're going to go to break. When we come back, I want to pick Dr. Hertzler's brain about a few things. I know he has some thoughts about junk science. He's got some good examples of that, like BPA and plastics and the food supply and things like that. So we'll be right back. Hey listeners, this is Dr. Lonnie Lowry. If you've ever had anyone critique you on your protein intake as part of your weightlifting lifestyle, oh, you poor meathead, all that extra protein is going to rot your kidneys or weaken your bones or dehydrate you or give you gout or who knows what. There is a book available. You could simply Google CRC Press and Lowry. And what I've done is reach out to experts all over the world and create a book, a single compendium that you can hold up and say, this is why I consume extra protein. This can be very valuable when you're being quote-unquote educated by various professionals on the topic. There's an enormous amount of literature in this book on the safety, the effectiveness, how protein works in cells, the history of protein and weight trainers, much more. So again, please check out CRC Press and Protein and Lowry. You can just Google that, and I do, full disclosure, I do make a small single-digit royalty on the book, but that's not why I did it. I did it so we can all have something, our particular population, to both defend what we do and to inform our nutrition and our eating. Thanks. IronRadio is, of course, primarily a podcast. But over the years, there have been technical glitches calling for backup streaming and listeners who wanted the convenience of other sources of audio content. Toward this end, IronRadio is now simulcast and backed up on YouTube. If needed, please search Lawnman07 or IronRadio from within YouTube. There's not much video, but if you like to listen through YouTube on a Roku or other living room device, there you go.
Like your weekly fix of Iron Radio? In addition to being a popular institute on iTunes, we are also on email. Simply go to www.ironradio.org and sign up for the voluntary email. You'll get a once per week email, no more, that's little more than the show notes and a link to the audio. So go for it.
All right, folks, we are back. We've got Dr. Steve Hertzler, who is your chief science officer, right, of a large supplement company.
Yeah.
Lots of clinical experience, bodybuilding experience. So in the topic, we want to talk about some of his thoughts that he's and opinions that he's gotten over the years, evidence-based, of course, but about junk science. Now, I know one of the things that you're passionate about is over-extrapolation of findings from animal studies or, big epidemiological studies that are sort of population-based and they're not necessarily causal. Maybe talk about that a little bit. Like, what are your concerns? Do you see that happen in sports nutrition? What's the deal with this over-extrapolation of findings?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some cases it's over-extrapolation, and in other cases I think it's also a matter of maybe people don't have as much perspective around where the studies come from and what they can actually tell you and what they can't tell you a lot of times. When I see epidemiologic studies come out and there's always these invariably these news blurbs that come out that say that doing something will whether it's some dietary behavior or exercise behavior that will increase your risk of heart disease by 25%, and something like that. And I remember I never really understood how they figured all that stuff out until I got to graduate school and started taking some biostatistics classes, and I started to understand a little bit about what hazard ratios and odds ratios really mean in the epidemiologic world. And I think I think one thing that people need to understand is that they need to have some sense of perspective on this increase in risk that shows up in nutritional epidemiologic studies. I've always kind of looked at nutritional epidemiologic studies as sort of, that's interesting. I wonder what kind of control clinical trials we could do based on this suspicion that we're getting from the nutritional epidemiologic studies.
Yeah, I like that term, suspicion, right? Because that's about what it supplies. Yep.
And unfortunately, I see a lot of people who are ready to start basing dietary guidelines on studies like this. And, number one is, you have the ever-present issue of observational versus causation. The problem with studies like that is there's only so many confounders that you can control for, even in the best of epidemiologic study designs. And I've seen a number of epidemiologic studies where I'll start reading the paper and all of a sudden something will jump to mind. It's like, well, that's interesting, but they forgot to adjust for this particular confounder. I remember seeing an epidemiologic study that was looking at the risk of having a high level of BPA in your urine and increased risk of heart disease. And they controlled for some obvious confounders like body mass index. They were using data from the N. Haynes study, which measures diet and exercise behaviors in a representative sample of the U.S. population. And it was kind of interesting because they controlled for body mass index, but they didn't control for canned food intake, like soda intake, for instance, which would, not only increase your urine BPA, but you also have the sugar content from the soda that could be a very important influence in this process. And, it's kind of one of those situations. Sometimes it's accidental, and I think sometimes it's intentional, where authors just simply choose to avoid analyzing for a particular confounder because they want to get a lot of media attention. Sometimes it's just purely accidental. I don't know what it was in that case, but I see a lot of things like that.
Yeah.
And the other, one of the other concerns I have with these types of studies too is helping people understand the magnitude of an odds ratio or a health risk ratio. And in nutritional epidemiologic studies, it's very common to see odds ratios or hazard ratios in the say 0.5 to about 2.5 range. Essentially, a rating of 1.0 means there's no relationship at all.
Mm-hmm.
A rating greater than 1 indicates
increased risk, right?
A positive increased risk, and then a ratio below 1 indicates decreased risk. And what I think people don't really understand is the magnitude of some of those numbers. One of the things that I did just out of fun one time is I was looking at the odds ratios for things where there's much stronger evidence of cause and effect, like cigarette smoking and lung cancer.
Mm-hmm.
All we have is observational studies on that one, but I've had a hard time finding anybody who can't link cigarette smoking and lung cancer. And when you start to look at odds ratios, hazard ratios from studies like that, you'll be looking at numbers somewhere between 9 and 20. Okay.
Yeah, huge. Yeah.
Humongous. I remember seeing one study one time of people with heartburn that was resistant to treatment and the risk of Barrett's esophagus and esophageal cancer.
Mm-hmm.
And in one of those variables, the odds ratio was 43.
Oh.
Okay.
Oh.
And, when I see an odds ratio of 9 to 20 or 43, I'm like, all right, I I'm very worried about this.
Right.
Okay, this is clearly cause and effect.
Causal, right.
Yeah.
Or likely, very
when
likely.
I see some of those other ones, I'm kind of like, well, interesting stuff, but I don't know.
Right on. No, I hear you. Now, I know that you have a little bit of a peeve about BPA and plastics and whatnot. You mentioned cardiovascular risk, but you're well read in that area. And I know some of our listeners, and myself included, I've been concerned about some of these issues, right? Like BPA, and you can measure it in people's serum. It's in packaging, and it's so ubiquitous, and that sort of thing. But is there, in your opinion, is it something we really shouldn't worry about? I mean, what about some of the xenoestrogen thing and the feminization of fish because it ends up in the streams and that kind of stuff?
Yeah, as I was saying before, for one thing, it's very difficult to do research on BPA because it is widespread in the environment. It's very difficult to find a laboratory that's not already contaminated with BPA. Mm-hmm. All the glassware, plastics, and things like that are used in analysis. It's in the dust. It's in every lab, when people are trying to measure blood values of BPA, you're talking typically about nanogram type levels. So you're talking about incredibly small concentrations, and even a little bit of contamination in your laboratory can give you a false positive in a blood sample that you're trying to measure, or in a urine sample. So a lot of times, the researchers who are doing a really good job in terms of doing quantification will actually feed their test animals or whatever. They'll use a deuterated form of BPA, which is metabolized the same way as BPA in the body, but it's traceable, and it's not an environmental contaminant. So you can actually get a better picture of what was ingested versus what's coming out in different parts of the body, whether it's blood or urine. Mm-hmm. And the other thing too is that there's some real concerns about limitations of animal models and route of ingestion. Rodents are typically used in a lot of these studies, mice and rats in particular. And they're not a real good model of humans from an endocrinology perspective. Their estrogen sensitivity differs dramatically between a human and a rodent, and the excretory pathways of BPA are very different between a human and a rodent as well. Humans are really good at absorbing BPA in first pass metabolism. The half-life of BPA in a rodent is much, much longer than it would be in a human. Mm-hmm. And in many studies I've seen it with BPA metabolism as well, they'll give the BPA via a different route of ingestion than the oral route. They'll give it under the skin or intraperitoneally, and those types of methods of ingestion don't represent how people usually take BPA in. The whole issue really is you sort of have some groups of scientists who are using those types of methods and are sounding a warning bell, and then you have other expert panels and stuff like that from the FDA, the European Food Safety Authority, the Japanese National Institutes, who are looking at the whole scope of the research that's out there, what is known about the metabolism of BPA in humans, and they're looking at the same data and saying, well, we really don't have anything to be concerned about here at this exposure level. Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of this running, there's sort of this running debate that has been going on for a while between some pockets of scientists and government organizations who have very different viewpoints. And a lot of it has to do with taking the research in and putting it in its appropriate context.
Okay. So I know this is very hard to do because I'm asking for a subjective value judgment here, but do you think listeners have something to be concerned about, like you'll hear circulating the fitness industry about people who they microwave things in plastic bowls and how it could leach it into their peanut butter or something, or, their foods, or whether it's the packaging that they get when they buy a prepackaged product. Do you think those levels of exposure, it's either too hard to control in those studies, or the exposure level is so low that they don't need to worry about it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure I'm not sure I can give you a hard and fast conclusion. And what I can say is, that most of the regulatory agencies are very well aware of these types of issues. BPA has been a very well studied chemical. There's a high level of understanding of how the chemical is metabolized, what its half-life is in the body, its ability to interact with estrogen receptors. And, generally, I do think that this is one of those situations where the expert panels have done a really good job of looking at all of the data that are out there and forming conclusions based on that. And so this is without necessarily giving you a conclusion of my own, I will say that this is one instance where you can have a little more trust in government panels and stuff like that, in the FDA and these different organizations.
Right. Let me ask you the tough question. Do you worry about it yourself, or is it so ubiquitous you're just kind of throwing your hands up and saying, listen, this is being monitored? What about you yourself?
I guess my take on it is that I try to focus on areas of much larger potential concern.
Okay.
I'm more worried about making sure that my blood cholesterol doesn't get too high, or my blood pressure doesn't get too high. Those types of risks. I feel like in a lot of instances you can almost paralyze yourself if you worry about these minute environmental risks, and you may be unnecessarily wasting a lot of money and different things like that trying to regulate risks that are so small to begin with. It's kind of like if somebody comes up to me and says, that my risk of getting struck by lightning goes up by 25%. Am I going to worry about that? No, because my baseline risk of getting struck by lightning is already so low.
Right. 25% increase of nothing is basically nothing.
Mm-hmm.
No, I hear you.
I know that there are people who have different opinions on that, and I respect that.
Yeah.
Me personally, I kind of tend to focus on risks that I think are of larger impact.
Right. No, and that's a good point. I mean, let's face it. I've been talking to an editor lately about writing an article. What may I eat? Right? Can't have gluten.
Yeah.
Can't have plastic. Can't have carbs. Can't have fats. Oh, protein's hard on your kidneys. XYZ. And after a while, you can't have cooked food. It's got to be raw. You can't have dairy. You can't. And after a while, it's like, well, what may I eat? Because this is getting ridiculous, So It's like this avoidance strategy that's going to make people paranoid. And like you said, if it's not actually much of an impact, maybe we're fussing over minutia with that stuff. But let me ask you one last thing before I let you go. Because of your position in the industry and your training as a scientist, what does matter? Like, what's coming down the pike in sports nutrition, for example? And I know you can't reveal like industry secrets and that sort of thing, but what trends do you see happening that you think have some value, or trends that are happening that don't have value? Maybe mostly on the good stuff. Like what's happening that's going to be hot? Can you speculate?
This sort of goes back to what we were talking about earlier as far as the gut microbiome. I am a strong believer because of the history that I've had with prebiotics, probiotics, the gut microflora, all that stuff that I've looked at in the past. I've watched that literature just begin to explode. I remember, talking to students one time about, and this was way back in like 2006, and I was talking about fecal transplantation,
right?
Where they were actually taking people who have, recurrent Clostridium difficile and flushing them out with the same prep that you usually do for a colonoscopy, and inoculating them with an entirely new flora from fecal sample from a donor.
Yeah.
And the success rate for curing that type of diarrhea with fecal transplantation is phenomenal.
Right.
And that was sort of one of the things that was kind of early on the curve, and now I think you're going to see the information that we're getting on the gut microbiome that's going to start permeating the fitness industry, because gosh, we know now that there's crosstalk between the gut and the brain, and there are C cells near the ileocecal junction, that they are signaled by some of the fermentation products of malabsorbed carbohydrates, and those C cells then send a message to the brain that says, "Hey, there's plenty of food down here. You probably don't need to eat so much right now."
Right.
And it's just fascinating to me, and I think the impacts on immunity and the ability of athletes to train at a high level and recover at a high level is going to become more and more and more dependent on having a healthy microbiome and making sure there's plenty of fuel sources around for those healthy bacteria in the gut to consume and do their fermentation, and sending a lot of these messages that need to be sent to the brain. I mean, heck, there's even the gut has its own neurons, for crying out loud.
Right. Yeah.
It's just amazing to me, and I think a lot of people, when they think about bodybuilding nutrition and stuff like that, they think about protein and different supplements like creatine, all of which I'm a big believer in, for sure. And those, I still like to stay with a lot of the tried and true supplements like creatine and HMB and stuff like that, beta alanine, plenty of protein. But the more and more I look at it, I'm thinking, wow, there may come a point in time where we're all going to have to be on a probiotic of some kind, to stave off some of the other, the consequences of aging and things like that, and the consequences of resistant bacteria, antibiotic resistant bacteria.
Right on. Yep.
Bugs have been fighting other bugs for a long time, and they have very advanced strategies for promoting their survival that we don't even fully understand yet.
It's funny, too, because you can extrapolate from other fields. Like, I overseed my lawn to try to keep the weeds down, right? Because the grass will outcompete the weeds. It's that kind of stuff, So, yeah.
Exactly.
No, that's... And honestly, that's been something we've been talking about on the show for a long time is... Yeah, the gut microbiome, and more recently, as you pointed out, even the effects on mood and decision making. It's almost weird. I have a student who he's very bright, and he's going to go into he wants his doctorate in nutrition, and one of his things is about the almost free will. Like on the deepest level, do we have as much free will as we think we do, or are we being heavily influenced by what we eat and through this gut microbiota mechanism, and the stuff like that. So it's fascinating stuff to look at for sure. Do you think there's going to be supplement products? I mean, there already are, but specifically in the sports nutrition market, like an explosion of stuff that really focuses on the gut?
Yeah, and I'm hopeful that I think there will be, and I think what you'll start to see in the next 10 or 15 years especially is different combinations of probiotic organisms and everything that are targeted to whatever your specific problem is. I mean, right now we're just sort of using a shotgun approach, and there's all kinds of different probiotics on the market, and they work for some people and they don't work for others, because we just don't really understand the individual characteristics of people well enough yet. And I think eventually we're going to start to say, for your particular genomic profile, these are the organisms that are going to work for you. And for somebody else, it could be a blend that's totally different. And I think we'll get a lot better specificity around that.
Right on. Cool stuff. All right. Well, thanks for spending the time with us. We are just about out of time.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Yeah, tons of information there from Dr. Hertzler. Good stuff. I'll tell you what, everyone, we're going to join you next week. We're lining up some future guests, of course, as always, interspersed with just the usual talk among the co-hosts, different topics and whatnot. But yeah, so there's from the horse's mouth, I think, on things like junk science, the value of clinical experience, all that kind of stuff, which are good messages in the fitness world, where we see a lot of the opposite, unfortunately. So, okay, we'll see everyone next time.
Cool. See you guys.
Thanks, guys.
Hey listeners, have you seen the store at IronRadio.org? There are 3 halls in the store. One for Phil, one for Fortress, and one for myself, Dr. Lowry, and they're thematic. So you can go into our Halls of Iron store and choose based on your goal. If you need something to learn or read or something nutritional, you can look in my store, Lonnie's store. If you want something about injury prevention or competition, then take a look at Phil's Hall of Iron. And if you want something about motivation or daily training, Fortress's Hall has what you're looking for. There are some fun, heroic descriptors as you browse through the stores. We try to make it a little more fun than the average boring online store. And whether you're a novice lifter or someone more experienced, you can take heart that you're not wasting your time. The things that we put in each Hall of Iron are actually based on our own recommendations. Protein powders that we know to be good, knee sleeves, wraps of some kind, things that Fortress uses in his own training. The stuff you see, you know is good. This way you don't waste time. So check out the Iron Radio store at ironradio.org and let us know what you think on the forums, and certainly you can request products and we will screen them before they go in. So thanks for listening. Iron Radio is accepting donations. If you like what we do, the professors, the scientists, the bodybuilding show promoters, the athletes themselves in powerlifting and bodybuilding, please consider making a donation or maybe buying something from the ironradio.org store. We also are accepting supporting members. So for $4 a month, which is frankly less than the bank sneaks out of your account in fees, you can step up and support a form of sort of public radio for the bodybuilding and powerlifting and strength community. The Iron Radio podcast and all of the audio on ironradio.org is for informational purposes only. If you're interested in starting a diet or exercise program, it's important to check with your physician. Also seek the help of registered dietitians, athletic trainers, and qualified exercise physiologists in order to make the progress that you need.